Hi folks, Florida Man here. Today, I bring you an after-action report on a game I played on PlayDiplomacy.com on the War in the Americas map. This game was played using the Age of Empires rules, which means the game is played in the era BC, when now famous modern empires are theoretically just being formed for the first time. Every player starts with one center in a location that would normally be a home center for that power, and then you choose what type of unit to put there, and from there you move as normal. Age of Empires is always build anywhere as well, so you can grow your country into historically unusual shapes. I was assigned to play as Britain in this game, and I therefore started with the single center of Halifax, in the northernmost part of the map. I started out by building a fleet, in the great tradition of Britain's historical empire. I reached out to various neighbors seeking alliance. Argentina was friendly and suggested we have an intelligence-sharing relationship. My first order of business, once the game started, would be either allying with the United States or eliminating him, depending on what was possible to do. I have good communications with Mexico at this point, so hopefully this will mean the downfall of the United States in this terribly violent alternate timeline. In spring 1899 BC, the USA and I moved toward each other like two fighters when the starting bells ring. On the surface, we're still pretending to be friendly, though I suspect it's just a smokescreen on both sides. In his messages, Argentina is warning me that he believes USA is opposed to me. I have no way of knowing either way, but I say that I believe USA might be hostile because it makes me seem less aggressive or doing what I planned to do already. Mexico moves toward Texas, as I hoped he would. Spain moves slightly north too, and as with Mexico, he says he's willing to join me against the US. I'm a little worried about too many people trying to take American land during this conquest, as it might mean there isn't enough plunder to go around, but as my father likes to say, you kill the closest snake first, then you can deal with the others. In South America, everyone's moving toward a neutral, except New Granada, who's already next to 4 neutral centers, which is better than anyone else's starting position on the Age of Empires version of the map. In the fall, everyone captures a neutral. Brazil opens toward the south, moving very close to Argentina, while Chile opens north toward Peru, and New Granada opens to Panama, which is a very good investment of time since it will allow him to build fleets to attack either continent. Mexico takes Texas, which for those of you who are history fans is historically a great way to set up conflict with the United States. I took New York City, which reminds me of the Revolutionary War. The United States took Washington, D.C., which was his only guaranteed option besides going after New Orleans. That put me and the USA right next to each other, so we agreed this would be the boundary between our two empires, and he would rule the south while I would rule the north. Then we lived happily ever after. To be continued. In the build phase, I got another fleet, as did Mexico and Spain. America got an army. To the south, it was mostly armies except for Venezuelans and Argentines. In spring 1898, USA went to Chicago, and I immediately backstabbed him and walked into the undefended Washington, D.C. To make matters worse for him, Mexico marched into New Orleans. This left the USA with only Chicago and Charleston, surrounded by 2 powers who were both larger than he was. To the south, Venezuela moved into the Caribbean to compete with Spain for control of those islands, while New Granada moved into the Pacific and became the only player competing for control of the islands out west. So far, I should note, New Granada was playing the game the way I would have ideally liked to play it myself, by expanding into uncontested areas and avoiding unnecessary fights. Brazil tried to move toward Venezuela and got bounced, seemingly abandoning his initial move south in favor of either occupying the center or moving north. Peru just expanded in a small circle, and Chile did something similar. Argentina seemed to be going for the Falklands, which again reminded me of history. When fall came, New Granada took Galapagos, Brazil moved both east and west, brushing up against Peru to the west, and Argentina walked into the center Brazil had left undefended by trying to expand in other directions, while also going for a mainland center rather than the Falklands as I had thought. I thought that there were some pretty good moves by Argentina and New Granada, and a very bad plan by Brazil, very similar to the plan the United States made in the spring. Remember, everyone, hoping your rivals won't attack you while you're vulnerable is not a plan. You have to have a very good motivation for them not to attack you if you're going to make yourself vulnerable, or better yet, don't expose them to the temptation. Peru and Chile basically constituted the normal territories each of their countries has in War in the Americas now. So nothing really exceptional or interesting in that region. Venezuela was carving out a coastal empire as well as walking into Santo Domingo, extending his influence into the middle of the Caribbean, right next to where Spain was building an island empire. Frankly, I thought this was a big mistake, unless Spain was for some reason happy sharing. Santo Domingo would be impossible for Venezuela to defend as things stood, and he could easily have taken a center that wouldn't have been so close to the Spanish holdings, like Trinidad or Puerto Rico. I don't necessarily think that becoming a naval power is a bad move for Venezuela on this map, per se. I just think that Venezuela isn't wise to act like a naval power with only one fleet. Speaking of Spain, he doubled in size again, as did Mexico and I, profiting from our bullying of the USA. With the build phase, I acquired both a new fleet and a new army, as did Mexico. It was like we were in sync. I knew I would have to be wary of him once the United States was gone, but for now, I didn't perceive him as an immediate threat. The fact that we were at parity was important, as was the fact that I believed I had Mexico willing to help me with the future common enemy of Spain. To the south, Spain acquired 2 more fleets, while Venezuela and New Granada acquired a fleet and an army each, and Brazil spent his single build on an army, which it seemed unlikely would be enough to salvage his position. The Brazilian position on the War in the Americas map reminds me a lot of the Russian one. It's large, but it can be unwieldy for some players, and if it struck a bad blow early on, it can be impossible to recover. All 3 of the other South American powers seemingly agreed on 1 army and 1 fleet each. Maybe they wanted to make sure New Granada wouldn't monopolize the Pacific Ocean or something. I'm sure Argentina was thinking about war with Brazil. When spring 1897 came, Argentina did indeed move north, seemingly against Brazil, but his plan was disrupted by Chile moving against him. Peru also moved against Brazil, though, so it seemed likely to be a drawn-out fight. To their north, New Granada continued to move toward neutral centers without opposition. Venezuela also moved toward Brazil, which seemed to seal Brazil's fate as far as I was concerned. In the Caribbean, Spain and Venezuela moved around each other without coming into direct conflict this season. It seemed inevitable that they would have a fight, though. They were too close, and there was too much of a power disparity in Spain's favor for it not to come to a fight. In North America, Mexico and I continued to enjoy success against the United States, though at this point, the American troops were basically running away rather than fighting. They had clearly forgotten the spirit of the Alamo. In fall, I walked into Chicago and Charleston, because the United States made the very foolish choice of not defending them and instead trying to sneak into New Orleans. Happily for me, Mexico chose this season to sneak into Spanish Havana, committing him against the Spanish and doubling him down on the alliance with me. Spain took Santo Domingo from Venezuela, as I could have predicted would happen, while Venezuela took Puerto Rico and expanded into Brazilian territory and a neutral that was near New Granada. Venezuela seemed poised to fight with 3 neighbors, though perhaps Spain would not be a problem thanks to me and Mexico, and Brazil was probably too weak to pose much threat. To the south, Peru also took a Brazilian center, reducing him to Rio de Janeiro and Belo Horizonte. In the southern cone, Chile took a neutral center that Argentina probably wanted, but at the same time Peru walked into a Chilean center. New Granada continued to just expand without fighting any battles. Truly a great position to be in. He now held Hawaii, Galapagos, Nicaragua, and Panama, while around him everyone else struggled in the dirt to make progress. In the build phase, New Granada and Venezuela both expanded their navies significantly, while Argentina and Chile both built armies, seemingly both aware their most important enemy was right next to them. I built 3 fleets and 1 army, while Mexico acquired 1 fleet and 1 army, giving us a massive armada with which to defeat the wounded dog known as Spain. In spring 1896 BC, New Granada made a mistake. He decided it would be a good idea to slide a fleet up to try and claim Alaska. Based on what he was saying, he was avoiding going for California or Oregon to avoid ticking off Mexico, but he didn't reckon on the fact that I was not going to let him keep Alaska. I told him so in fairly unambiguous terms, though. It was unfortunate that I waited until this season to message New Granada for the first time, because he had developed some hopes and expectations that he might acquire some territory in North America, and he was unwilling to give them up just based on my opposition. On the east coast, I was repositioning to go after Spain. Speaking of Spain, he was facing attack from Mexico, me, Venezuela, and New Granada. At this point, he stopped entering orders, giving up on the game, which was just a terribly annoying thing to do. He could potentially have salvaged his position with some skillful diplomacy, but he chose not to try. Venezuela and New Granada were also moving south in South America, but Brazil seemed likely to hang on for another year or so rather than immediately perishing, because Argentina and Peru were more distracted by Chile than by him, though nothing conclusive was happening between those 3 yet. In the fall, Chile continued to hold off Peru and Argentina fairly well, but New Granada joined in the fight by attacking Peru. Argentina and Peru got a little bit more land by attacking Brazil, although Brazil managed to stay at 3 centers by taking a center from Venezuela, who made a mistake in not supporting himself to hold in Sao Salvador, instead using Sao Salvador to support an attack which ended up being unsuccessful. In the north, New Granada grabbed Jamaica from the surrendered Spanish, while they temporarily held off my advance at sea. New Granada listened to my warning on Alaska and instead went for Oregon, which was destined to be Mexican property. After this point, I was urging Mexico to commit his whole navy to fight against the apparent alliance of New Granada and Venezuela, and Mexico agreed to begin doing so after this season. In the build phase, Mexico acquired new fleets, as I hoped he would, but so did Venezuela and New Granada. Further south, the only one who built was Argentina, who acquired a fleet and an army. Brazil could have rebuilt his lost army but didn't take the opportunity. In spring 1895 BC, Mexico and I swept over to both the abandoned Spanish islands and the Venezuelan and New Granadan units in the Caribbean, moving to stop their advances. We surrounded Oregon country to retake it as well. To the south, Peru and Argentina continued to wage war with Chile and Brazil, with a fair degree of success, since Brazil wasn't fighting. Unfortunately for them, however, New Granada continued to attack Peru by land, more than erasing any gains Peru was making. In the fall, Peru got invaded even further, reducing him to 3 scattered centers that seemed destined never to come together again. Brazil died at the hands of Peru, Argentina, and Venezuela. Chile continued to hold his ground fairly well, though. Argentina began moving around the south of the continent, preparing to use his navy to attack Chile, it seemed. To the north, New Granada and Venezuela pushed me back a bit at sea. In North America itself, while we took Oregon from New Granada, he walked into California. At this point, Argentina was promising that he would soon be able to help out with New Granada, which I was both pleased and apprehensive about. If Mexico and I couldn't make progress on our own, Argentina might be helpful, but he would probably wait for a convenient time for himself, and he might end up being the big winner if he helped us out. As you can see in the retreat phase, getting pushed back a little bit wasn't so bad for me. The truth is that on the east side of the map, the Atlantic and Caribbean side, we have slightly more fleets between Mexico and myself than New Granada and Venezuela do, and we just need to make sure we can deploy all of those fleets on the front line so that we can actually win the battle at sea. In the build phase, we all get more fleets. New Granada got 3 new fleets, 2 of which were in the west, where he already had an edge in the number of fleets, but they're harder to use due to a more cramped space, with the other one being in Panama. Venezuela's new fleet was a little better placed in Trinidad on the eastern front. I acquired 2 new fleets, in Charleston and Greenland, and Mexico got a fleet on the west coast of Guatemala, to help even up the imbalance on the west coast. In spring 1894 BC, in the Caribbean, we pushed New Granada back a little bit, but there were so many fleets in the water, the progress felt like it would be extremely incremental. To the south, Chile and Argentina were killing off Peru, while at the same time Argentina was still moving units toward Chile. In the northwest, New Granada pushed into North Pacific Ocean, while we retook California. I retreated the North Pacific Ocean unit forward, a maneuver I always like, into the Gulf of Santa Catarina. In fall, we lost ground again at sea in the Caribbean, but that was in exchange for inching toward taking more of the abandoned Spanish centers. Mexico was inching toward another center on the island of Cuba, while I took Santo Domingo. It was unfortunate to be losing sea spaces, but as more than one scholar of diplomacy has noted, it's the land spaces that get you builds. Thanks to this season's maneuvers in the Caribbean, I would have a build that I wouldn't have otherwise. On the other hand, neither Venezuela nor New Granada gained any net centers this year. To the south, New Granada took Santa Cruz, one of the last Peruvian centers, which made up for his loss in North America. Argentina took Belo Horizonte, the other remaining Peruvian center, as well as a Chilean center. In the build phase, Mexico and I built more boats. Boats. To the far south, Argentina built 2 armies, which seemed to bode very ill for Chile, and probably Venezuela and or New Granada after that. In spring 1893 BC, we worked to deploy more of our naval capacities to the front lines. Venezuela walked into Santo Domingo, but I was optimistic that with me now in Sargasso Sea and Canal Viejo, and Mexico in North Caribbean, I could take it back in fall. On our western front, frankly not much was happening, because New Granada wasn't trying hard enough to prosecute that war. Instead of advancing his fleets in the Pacific, he held them steady in more of a defensive posture. In the far south, Argentina was still invading Chile, and New Granada was positioned as if he wanted to get in on that action. In the fall, New Granada grabbed a Chilean center, while Argentina moved more units around the southern tip of the continent. Now Chile was down to just 3 centers, and this would not be a hard fight anymore for Argentina or New Granada. The only question was where Argentina would go next. With his navy, he could try to be of some marginal help to Venezuela and New Granada in the north, but a much more logical move would be to use his substantial army to sweep up and smash those 2 stagnant powers and make himself the lord of all South America. To the north, New Granada was finally moving his fleets into action against me in Mexico, positioning now to go after Alaska. In the Caribbean, Mexico gets Santiago de Cuba, and I retake Santo Domingo, so for right now, neither of us is actually losing any ground in terms of supply centers. We're still advancing, in fact, in the Caribbean, where we have the enemy fleets clearly outnumbered. The movement is very slow, though. Going to the build phase, all 4 of the belligerents acquire more fleets, while Argentina builds another army. It's pretty obvious what he's decided to do. In spring 1892 BC, the Argentine military invades one of the last 3 remaining Chilean centers and supports New Granada into another of those centers. But Argentina moves everything else north, toward New Granada and Venezuela. It looks like the all-out conquest of the South American continent by its southernmost surviving power is set to begin. The only problem from my perspective is that since he waited so long to get up to this, Argentina has a good shot at soloing by doing this, especially if New Granada and Venezuela continue to focus on me and Mexico as they have been thus far. In the north, you can see the fight between us and the South Americans is still going back and forth, with New Granada pushing into Alaska and Venezuela pushing into the wide Sargasso Sea again. Since this is the spring, none of this has really lasting consequences, but it is annoying for progress to always be 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Going to fall, Mexico and I push New Granada out of Alaska, retake Sargasso Sea, and get into the critical space of East Caribbean, a crucial space for the Venezuelan defense effort. At the same time, Argentina is now attacking New Granada in deadly earnest, taking the center of Easter Island that he had given to New Granada before, as well as the New Granadan center of Santa Cruz and the Venezuelan center of Sao Salvador. He's benefiting from how dedicated the other South Americans have been to the war they've been slowly losing with us. According to Argentina, New Granada and Venezuela were threatening to throw the game to me in Mexico if he kept attacking at this point, but it was pretty clear Argentina was laughing at that idea. At the same time, New Granada was requesting that Mexico and I leave him in Venezuela alone to fight Argentina. In the build, Argentina builds 3 new fleets and an army, while Venezuela builds 2 armies and New Granada builds a southern fleet. Everyone is refocusing on the war in the south now, the only war that really matters at the moment. In spring 1891 BC, there is a 4-way conversation between me, Mexico, Venezuela, and New Granada, in which New Granada and Venezuela are expressing strong concern about the possibility that Mexico and I will take their centers while they fight Argentina. I express my willingness to let them live if they let our fleets come south to fight Argentina and participate in stopping the solo. My plan here was that we'd get behind the Venezuelan and New Granadan lines, and after Argentina was dead, we'd have a dramatic advantage in position and win fairly easily. Mexico commented that according to Argentina's assessment, Argentina did not believe he could win. Privately, Mexico was expressing to me that this should become our opportunity to invade Venezuela and New Granada without them being able to properly defend themselves. I expressed to Mexico that we had to be careful about pushing the New Granada and Venezuela players too hard here because we could cause them to give up on fighting Argentina if we were too aggressive. I told Mexico we would get further with a kind word and a gun than we would with a gun alone. The result is that Mexico and I are suddenly able to advance south with no opposition, so we can come to the rescue of the New Granadan and Venezuelan people. I take the last Spanish center of Haiti, Argentina continues to invade New Granada, while Venezuela begins to form a pretty good line in the northern Brazilian region. Mexico walks into the Gulf of Venezuela, preparing to take Maracaibo from Venezuela. Venezuela had actually agreed to this, understanding that Mexico was a little impatient with our inability to grow in the short term. But when New Granada saw it, he complained very obnoxiously, suggested that we should throw some centers to him in Venezuela, and began very quickly threatening to throw the game to Argentina. New Granada ultimately concluded that he was going to refrain from defending himself until we became cooperative with him, whatever that meant. He said he didn't care about his rating on the site, only about being with cooperative players. In fall, Argentina walks into 2 New Granadan centers and surrounds several others, because New Granada is much more interested in opposing my and Mexico's advance than he is in defending from Argentina. Venezuela is still holding steady in his defense against the Argentinians, but this is not looking good for our ability to stop Argentina from achieving the solo. Argentina was messaging me both this season and last season, trying to suggest I should work with him in the south. My response was direct. I told him that he was much too close to solo, and the only way I planned to fight New Granada and Venezuela rather than helping them against him was if Argentina started just supporting himself to hold in place. He refused and acted as if I was wronging him in some way, which was pretty funny. Unfortunately, the reality was that New Granada continued to be obnoxious and stubborn in private messages, and it was apparent that Mexico, Venezuela, and I would have to eliminate him as quickly as we could to keep him from giving the whole game to Argentina. Yes, you heard that correctly. Venezuela was on my and Mexico's side in this disagreement, because New Granada was that unreasonable. Venezuela said he had been that way all along, essentially, and had finally exhausted his patience. This was an ominous moment for all of us who opposed the Argentinian solo possibility, but it seemed the die was cast. In the build phase, Argentina gets a new army and 2 more fleets, Mexico and I each get a fleet, and Venezuela destroys one of his southern fleets. Going to spring 1890 BC, New Granada does very little, next to nothing, to defend himself from the Argentinian invasion, while Mexico and Venezuela prepare to attack New Granada and protect those centers from Argentinian capture. In fall, Mexico supports me into Hawaii, but unfortunately, New Granada lets Argentina into another 3 centers. Argentina is consuming New Granada faster than Mexico, Venezuela, and I, and it's becoming obvious that we will not be able to outrace Argentina in his pursuit of solo unless something major changes. In the build phase, New Granada destroys his fleets in the area Argentina and the North American forces are fighting for dominance over. Mexico got a new army that was clearly not going to ever be useful for anything, while Venezuela got a new army right near the front lines, and I got a new fleet. In spring 1889 BC, New Granada continued to sabotage our ability to stop the solo with great and terrifying success, abandoning Cusco to Argentine control and forcing his way into Mexican-controlled Cartagena. Mexico, Venezuela, and I made no corresponding gains that would make up for these losses. In fall, we made marginal advancements at sea and in neutral spaces, but we didn't retake Cartagena, and Argentina didn't lose any centers. In the build phase, Argentina got 2 more fleets. At this point, the end result was fairly obvious to me. Although none of us want Argentina to win, unfortunately no one but me was willing to try and reconcile with New Granada at this point. In fairness, the New Granada player had been fairly annoying for much of the game, in both group messages with the rest of us and, according to Venezuela, prior to that. At any rate, none of us stopped fighting against Argentina through the endgame. But we are unsuccessful, and he solos thanks to New Granada deliberately giving him the game. I can't say that Argentina didn't earn his victory here. He fought hard for years, positioned himself very cleverly, got Venezuela and New Granada to turn their backs on him fully while they fought me in Mexico, and outfought me in Mexico at sea during the last several years of the game, preventing us from ever successfully taking and keeping a single Argentine center. Despite the fact that we had been thoroughly defeated, Venezuela and Mexico were sort of happy with the result, because New Granada had been completely purged from the map. While I admit that the New Granada player absolutely deserved this, I did not think this result made up at all for our defeat. But I did not argue the point. I must admit I was frustrated in this game, and I feel I failed to exert my influence over my partners properly. Mexico was eager for expansion, and I should have, and could have, restrained him and put us in a better negotiating position with the volatile New Granada player. New Granada was an annoying idiot, but I should have assessed him better and realized he would make himself into a big problem if Mexico and I didn't restrain ourselves in the way we communicated with him. We should have flattered him, sugar-coated things, and focused on concrete objectives rather than arguing with him about details that ended up being unimportant. That is not to say we spent much time arguing with him, but New Granada did manage to blow up in outrage over some pretty minor disagreements. I'm sure the other 2 players I was allied with would agree with me on this. Other than those mistakes, I think I played a good game. I wish I had been successful in getting Venezuela to turn on New Granada sooner, or in keeping New Granada and or Venezuela from going after us when they became secure in South America. But that probably would have involved me and Mexico destroying each other, which would of course be the worst of all possible worlds. At a certain point, the game was Argentina's to lose. I hope you enjoyed this diplomacy commentary. If so, I hope you will like, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and comment below with your thoughts on the game. If you really like this stuff, you should consider joining the folks whose names now appear on screen, the extra dedicated people who open up their wallets or their laptops and either contribute money or translate the video's subtitles into other languages. You too can be a part of the production and promotion of this content. Until next time, Florida Man out.